Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Dr. Ehrman has a course called Finding Moses. Be sure to go sign up. You can learn some interesting things from a historian, scholar on biblical studies. He knows his Hebrew Bible. And welcome back to MythVision, Dr. Ehrman.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, pertaining to Moses, as this course is called Finding Moses. I just went to Israel, of course, or the Holy Land, if you will, not to get into politics. And we were trying to find Jesus, meaning following in the footsteps. When it comes to Moses, this is a whole interesting topic many people have their thoughts about. And I'm wondering if there's any connection between the monotheism of Akhenaten and that eventually developed by the Proto-Israelite desert tribe wandering around Northwest Arabia during this period. You may know the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, who wrote a book called Moses and Monotheism back in the 1930s that advanced such a hypothesis with Moses as the intermediary. However, if Moses never existed, it would have still been possible for the idea to reach the tribe through interactions with traders, soldiers, and mining operations Egypt had in the Sinai. Such a connection is feasible from a time perspective since Akhenaten ruled from about 1356 to 1334 BC, while the first evidence of Israel monotheism did not occur for another century, or we could even go further. How would you respond to this?
It's a great question. A lot of people have wondered about it because you do get this Pharaoh who he didn't become a monotheist. He became monotheist. He became a monolater. He believed in worshiping only one God, and he made that the official God. And so it's about 100 years before the Exodus event is allegedly probably happened. And so is it possible that, these Israelites are in Egypt and they get influenced by Egyptians or even after they come out of Egypt? And so it's a very good question. The issues are complicated by a number of factors. One is we don't know when Israel actually became emphatically insistent on worshiping only Yahweh. Most scholars today don't think that the Exodus story, as it happens in the book of Exodus, could possibly have happened in the way it's described, where you've got several million people leaving their slavery and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and the entire Egyptian army being destroyed, and they're in the wilderness for 40 years before conquering the land. That story is implausible on lots of levels. So I'll be talking about it in my course. It's not that nothing happened. Probably something happened where the people who later identified themselves as Israel had stories about having some kind of origin in Egypt, as Semites in Egypt. So something probably happened. But what is another question. The other question, though, is when did these people in what we would later call Israel, then it was Canaan, when did this group of people start becoming when do they start worshiping only one God, start practicing monolatry rather than being polytheists? And that's hard to say. You don't get monotheism itself until you don't get monotheism until the book of 2nd Isaiah, until like the 6th century. And so that's the first place that you have anybody say there's only one God. And so it's unlikely that's being picked up from Egyptian roots at that point. You later, by the way, get monolatry in Greek and Roman circles, where people will acknowledge other gods, but they start worshiping one God because this is the greatest God. And so it's not just Egypt, and it's not just Israel. It's also different Greek and Roman groups. And the question is, how does that happen? It may be that somebody's borrowing from somebody, but it may also be that there's this kind of movement that happens within religion where, like, you're worshiping a bunch of gods, and then you kind of limit it because you can't worship them all. And then you pick some, and you start saying, you are the greatest you are the most powerful, you are the most wise, and eventually that's the one you worship because you go for the best. And if that may have happened within Israel, as it happened at one moment in Egypt, 100 or 400 years earlier, depending when it happened in Israel, and it certainly happened later in Rome.
I hope people will check out your course because it's extremely enlightening for people to understand the context of what you're describing. I did an interview with Kara Cooney, who's an Egyptologist who wrote a book called The Good Kings. We mentioned monotheism and Akhenaten, and there is a debate among Egyptologists of whether or not it's monotheism or, like you're talking about, I guess you could say henotheism or monolatry. At the end of the day, though, the political power that kind of structure had, she said it's never completely left Earth from that point onward. It's almost like the impact that people in power saw that monotheism, or if you will, this having a supreme power at the top, was so useful as a tool in political power that it eventually gets harnessed in many situations in that respect. But I like what you're saying. It's kind of an evolutionary idea, where eventually there's like a supreme ultimate being. And I wonder if there's a conflation of ideas. Babylon making Marduk the supreme, even though there are other gods. And we know that they ruled the Israelites. So it's difficult for me to put my finger on who did it. Was it Assyria? Was it Babylon? Was it the Persians? Could it be a mix of all over time? Do you have a thought on that?
I think, well, so I'm very cautious myself, insisting on an evolutionary model, strictly speaking. I think that the evolution does happen. Of course, everything changes, and it doesn't mean it changes for the better. I mean, evolution doesn't necessarily, it can be a devolution as well as an evolution. I think, though, that in a lot of polytheistic cultures, at least the ones we know about in the West and in the ancient Near East, that a pantheon usually does have more powerful gods than others. And so, in the Greek tradition, Zeus is the father of the gods, and he's more powerful than the others. In the Roman tradition, it's Jupiter and as you say, you get Marduk, or maybe you get in various ancient Near Eastern culture, you get various divine beings, and you get that, and then so I'm not sure that the way to do it is to say there's somebody who started it and the others saw the political value of it. I don't think that that's actually how history usually works. I don't see much evidence that Egypt, with its brief 14th century monotheism, had much of an effect on Greece or Rome or Judaism or Christianity. So I don't think it worked that way. I don't think that, like, oh, hey, look, they've got one God. That means, and eventually in Christianity, of course, it does become a political thing. In Christianity, as Elaine Pagel showed in her book, The Gnostic Gospels, in early Christianity, the emphasis that Christians made that there's one God, that the Orthodox Christians made, that there's one God, against Gnostics saying there are lots of gods. Because if you got one God, then you got one bishop. And the bishop is insisting there's only one God, because then you don't have a bunch of power structures, you have one. And so it can be used as a political tool. But I'm not sure that that's how religions develop, by way of kind of it sounds a little, I'm not sure if she's trying to be cynical about it or not, but I think that it does, I just don't think religions work that way generally.
And then the last question is a simple subjective one on your part. What do you think about Moses apologetics? I mean, you're a historian, so you stay in your lane. And I guess it's a real personal question is, do you kind of get annoyed? Do you think, man, like they're just not dealing, they're overstretching the evidence? Like, how do you personally feel about people who want to bend over backwards to try and prove that the biblical narrative as portrayed, you either misunderstand it, the numbers, oh, well, it doesn't mean those numbers. Like, they always find a way to make the story reliable, trustworthy, this really happened. What are your subjective thoughts about this whole notion?
My view is that all we have is subjective thoughts, because we're subjects. And I think that all of us have biases and prejudices of one kind or another. And I think the task of history is to bracket your preconceptions as well as you can, to hold your beliefs and your prejudices and your worldviews at bay, and try to figure out what happened in the past. And that there aren't different methods for doing that for fundamentalists and liberal Methodists and Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox and, Muslims and Buddhists and Jews. I mean, it's like history is the kind of thing that anybody can do. And it requires that you look at evidence and let the evidence lead you to your conclusions, rather than allowing your conclusions to lead you to your evidence. My view about the events of the Exodus and Moses, of course, when I was a Christian, I believe these were literally true. And I continued to think that for a long time. But then as a Christian, I came to realize that they just can't be true historically. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, when you have an Exodus, in the book of Exodus, 600,000 military-age men leave Egypt. So men 20 years and older, and not including the elders who can't serve in the army, not including the women, not including the children, boys and girls. So you're talking at least 2.5 million people. And so how is it that if you line up 2.5 million people, how long's the line? Okay, so they're not walking in single file, but they are all camped out at this one oasis. So how do you get, and it says they're in a camp. How do you get 2.5 million people in a camp? And how do you get the whole assembly together? And how do you feed that many? Of course, you use manna, I guess. But just on historical terms, does this make any sense? Without there being any archaeological record of it or any mention of it in any source other than the Bible. And so at some point, you're either going to decide to be a historian or to be a believer. And if you're a believer, you can be a believer who's a historian. But if you decide that you're not going to base it on historical evidence, that's okay. It's fine. You can do that. Then you're an apologist or an evangelist or something else, but you're not a historian. And if you don't want to be a historian, it's fine. But my objection is people who claim to do history who refuse to look at historical evidence and the absence of historical evidence. And so that's my view. So I know lots and lots of Christians who absolutely think that the Exodus could not have happened the way it's described. It just could not have happened. And they're just, they're being historians at that point. They still believe, they still believe in Christ, or they still believe in God. It's a story. If you kind of claim it's historical, you need to mount some evidence for it, and good luck with that. There are some things that show that something happened. There are clear that I'll talk about in my course. It is weird that the name Moses is not a Hebrew name. It's not Hebrew. It's not an Israelite. It's an Egyptian name. It's Egyptian. So that's weird. How do you account for it? So there are things you got to figure out. But the idea that it happened as described is completely implausible, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman. I really appreciate your time. I hope people will go sign up for the course, Finding Moses. It's down in the description. Hope to see you there. Thanks.